Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. And they are a fun little bunch, mostly Booker related, as you'll see, but some kind of fun ones in here nonetheless. But let's get started with Eimear McBride's Something Out of Place. And so this is just a book I've sort of picked up while I was buying something else and just sort of was like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, I'll give this a go. I love Eimear McBride's other writing, well, the bits I've read of hers, Strange Hotel and Girl is a Half-Formed Thing. I think both of those are brilliant. And this is her writing nonfiction. And in this, she's mostly turning her sort of pen, I guess, or turning her focus more towards women's rights and particularly sort of both moments of everyday sexism, but also sort of media depictions of women and sort of what that largely looks like. So she talks in quite a lot of detail about various aspects of things, particularly sort of double standards placed on women. But as the sort of the sort of subtitle of this book hints at, women and disgust, she talks a lot about the kinds of ways that misogyny is often baked into a lot of day-to-day interactions, a lot of day-to-day media representations of women, and the harmful effects that has. And I just thought, you know, for sort of a short, sharp book was a really good focus on some of those areas. And particularly, I think she writes really powerfully about just the kind of the utter rage that many women feel at just feeling stuck between, you know, several worlds of, you know, an expectation on them to have children, and then if they do have children, they're terrible parents, and if they don't have children, they're awful, but also if they have children, they're awful, and just you know, the sorts of various ways that this sort of pressure comes down on women. And yeah, so I think she writes really compellingly. I mean, it covers so many different topics that it's kind of almost hard to pin down. She sort of races between bits, and but the research within it is really powerful. And I think something that's quite powerful and sort of terrifying at the same time is in the afterword, she mentions how while the proofs of this book were going to print or going to her publishers, the Sarah Everard case in the UK was happening, which is where a woman was murdered. It was later found out that it was by somebody who was in the police force, and when the police report kind of came around, it was not very well handled, let's say. And so she sort of talks about how this is you know, the kind of the state of being a woman, particularly in this case in the UK and Ireland, is just one of constantly trying to just try and work out what on earth is going on around you, basically. Next up, a few of these, because the next ones are bookery, so I will go into them at various points during their shortlists. But I've got two here from the 2008 shortlist, both of which I really loved. So the first is Linda Grant with The Clothes on Their Backs. And I read another book of hers, The Story of the Forest, earlier this year, which I loved. And I'm starting to just maybe feel like Linda Grant is one of those authors that I am just very naturally drawn to. She writes a lot about memory, about history, about sort of family history and what kind of is passed along and what isn't. A lot of this is sort of interwoven with her experience, with Linda Grant's experience as a woman whose parents moved from Eastern Europe to the UK to escape persecution as a Jewish family. And so her life has sort of been informed by the stories of migration and refugees and various other ways that people have to sort of find how to make a new home somewhere else and how to kind of keep alive their history and their family and all those things. And that comes up in a really big way in The Clothes on Their Backs, where a Hungarian family is trying to really find a foothold in the UK, trying to really work out how to exist, but also, you know, the book sort of starts going into the 70s and 80s, and particularly the main character, she's not only trying to sort of find family history, but she's also running up against neo-Nazis in the UK, and sort of racist groups and anti-fascist groups that kind of agree, kind of created in response, and how, you know, this sort of idea of moving for safety isn't a guaranteed state. You can move for safety and be safer, but maybe still not entirely safe. And I think she captures that really well here. And also just these really beautiful lines occasionally, just really reminiscing about the role of memory or family, I just think are so well handled in this book. And from short, sharp books by women to two chunky, absurdist books by men. The first of those on the same shortlist as Linda Grant's The Clothes on Their Back is Steve Toltz with A Fraction of the Whole. And this is a book that is incredibly funny in many ways. It's really absurd, it's really wild and bold, but also really quite profound, I think. It's about 700 pages, which this copy doesn't look like, because it's just very thin pages, but this is 700 pages. But I actually think it's a book that sort of deserves that length. It's this sort of epic of a father. Well, it's a sort of three men in particular are kind of at the center of this book. One of them is a man who sort of becomes very well known in Australia for and sort of vilified publicly. He's sort of hated by Australian media, and his brother is well beloved, and is seen as sort of having, you know, held off his brother from doing the worst things, or kind of being a sort of good versus evil in that respect. And then he, a lot of the book is also about his son, and his son sort of growing up in this thing where everybody wants to know about his uncle. Everybody wants to know the family history of this terrible man. And so what you get is these sorts of passages where sometimes it's the father trying to tell his son all of everything he's learned in life and how to be this stand-up respectable man. Occasionally you've got moments where they are, you know, trying to build a new life after everything's fallen apart, and all of that is incredibly dark and incredibly punchy in the way it does it. It's also really absurd and funny, it in a very kind of Australian kind of way, a very laconic, very dry humor, but it's also just incredibly absurd. We've got these sort of slightly fantastical things that happen throughout the book, but also these really brilliant one-liners that are just just wild. I think at one point, you know, I think essentially what I really enjoy is he always takes the joke that little bit too far. So you will have, for example, it's not enough for him to just talk about a fact of depression, I think it is in the book, being the number one killer of a certain age of young men. He then has to kind of twist that very tragic thing into a joke, which is, and the second thing is people dying of eye strain from watching too much internet pornography. And you just sort of like, that line was so not necessary, but also really builds the character of this book, which is this wild, absurd book. Like at one point, for example, the characters in this sort of small Australian town realize that their town has been called the least livable place in all of Australia. And so they decide to make that a tourist thing, and to basically say, hey, come and visit the worst place to live in Australia. Tourists then come, they treat them like absolute rubbish to help kind of fuel that fantasy, and make a lot of money in a couple of years, which they then don't really use to make the town better. They just kind of keep it as it is. And so there's a lot of this sort of almost gutter humour of everyone in the book is kind of just at their absolute worst, and they're all just kind of crabs in a barrel trying to fight to get their way out. I just thought this was so clever, and I think this was a debut as well, which is kind of wild, because this is, really a very funny, very silly book, but with a real emotional weight to it, that I think is really deceptive at the beginning of this book. And last but not least, but keeping up that kind of feeling of good versus evil, we have Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. This is a very controversial book in many ways. it was a book that led to there being various sort of fatwas and sort of death notices basically placed on Salman Rushdie's life. It is a book where even sort of, for example, translators were being targeted. And, you know, I think last year or the year before when Salman Rushdie was attacked, this was sort of still seen as part of the reason. And this book was published in 88, I believe, or 87. It was the 88 Booker Prize where it was shortlisted. And it's kind of wild looking back on it now, not only because of where that conversation's gone and what's happened in real life, where, you know, some of the translators of this book have been killed. Many other translators have published, you know, have translated it anonymously and in top secret conditions. But also because so many books have been released that I think probably take the core ideas or the key jokes within this book and push them far further, actually. But basically, the heart of it is there is a plane that is going down over London, and these two men who basically sort of play almost the roles of good and evil, and are based on Quranic, is that the word? Based on characters, based on people from the Quran. Are then kind of used as this sort of wider exploration of the notions of good and evil, or the notions of statehood and nationalism and various other things. For example, one of the characters is an Anglophile who is obsessed with the idea of anything English, and so he in some ways is there both as a sort of comic foil, but also to sort of problematize the very notion of what it is to have a nation, because you know, nationalism is so rooted in the idea of this kind of, I was born here, this is, you know, that I can trace my ancestors back through this land. And actually, if you've got this sort of Anglophile character who comes in and is almost more knowledgeable or more obsessed with various aspects of the nation than many of the people around them, what does that say about nationalism? So there are quite a lot of things like that where Salman Rushdie, and I think in his best work, he often does this a lot. I mean, he does this all the way through all of his work, really, but he is a big fan of poking fun or sort of prodding an issue and taking it to its logical extreme to really blow up what it's doing. And so here he really takes aim at nationalism, and sort of particularly nationalism bound up with religion and bound up with other things, and he's really kind of engaged with that topic throughout this book. And I will say, I always forget this every time I read Salman Rushdie books, because between them I always forget just how funny and absurd he can be at times, and this book is sort of no exception, really. He has these sort of he'll have a lot of characters who will just go on these lengthy rambles or discussions that kind of go nowhere, but are sort of just fun because we as the audience sit there and can also poke fun at those characters. So it's kind of he does these kind of quite layered and quite tricksy kinds of jokes throughout the book. But I think apart from that, it has quite a strong weight to it in terms of, well, not only because it's actually very heavy, but a lot of emotional weight in what he's doing with trying to poke fun at various things. It's not my favorite Salman Rushdie book of the ones I've read of his. I you know, Midnight's Children and Quixote, I think probably are up there for me, but I still kind of appreciate this as sort of part of the Salman Rushdie canon, of sort of seeing what he is doing here and how he was sort of unafraid of being a sort of troublemaker in some ways, of, you know, nobody is off limits for who he might target with his jokes, whether that's religion or history or whatever, as well. So those are all the books that I've read this week, and it's been an interesting set of some quite chunky ones and some slightly thinner books. But yes, reading it's been a good reading week, but it's also lots of big chunky books coming my way for the 2008 Booker, and also just for a few other shortlists and things as well. I hope you've been having a really good week. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.